And you're very welcome. You're on the next level. This is The Beautiful Truth with Fintan Dunne reporting. Thanks for joining us. Thanks also to our sponsor neemwell.com, your personal source for potent Indian neem. Kathy McMahon of neemwell.com formulates Indian neem in hypoallergenic creams and lotions. The most kick-ass herb on the planet. And if you haven't checked it out, you definitely should at Neemwell. That's NEEMWELL.com. Or you can email Kathy, KATHY, at neemwell.com. Well, you're welcome to part 2 of the final verdict, in which we'll be taking a close look at the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. In part 1, we looked at claims which have been made about the Twin Towers, their structural integrity, their ability to resist an impact by a large jet, the kind of steel that was used in it, and more. And we also looked at how the whole question of controlled demolition had been seeded into the 9/11 movement from very early on by news anchors on the day of the attacks, by Van Romero of New Mexico Tech, even by Larry Silverstein. Now in part 2, we'll be taking a look later at the question of what did bring down the Twin Towers and could they have been brought down by fire, as is claimed in the official versions. And we will be beginning by taking a look at some of the many theories around that issue of controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. And there are so many of them. And if we have indeed been steered in the direction of controlled demolition deliberately, boy, has that paid off, because the question of the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers has attracted more theories and more wacky theories than any other area of 9/11 research. It's like a modern version of the life of Brian. What have Twin Tower demolition theories ever given us, eh? Thermate? Well, yeah, obviously thermate, that goes without saying. But other than thermate, what have the Twin Tower demolition theories ever given us? Shaped cutter charges, Reg? Well, granted, that's there as well. But other than thermate and shaped cutter charges, what have the 9/11 demolition theories ever given us? Pyroclastic flow, Reg? Pyroclastic flow too, yeah. Other than that, what have the pools of molten steel, Reg? Okay, pools of molten steel. Holographic planes, free fall, that's right, free fall as well, yeah. The pod? Oh, pod, yes. And squibs, Reg? Yes, squibs, granted, squibs as well. But other than thermate, shaped cutter charges, pyroclastic flow, pools of molten steel, holographic planes, free fall, the pod, and squibs, what have Twin Tower demolition theories ever given us, eh? Well, they've given us a headache. They've given me a headache. And I'd like to take a look at this issue of controlled demolition, and both specifically and generally. Now, before even looking at any of the specifics of the controlled demolition, there are some general points which are well worth making. You know, in a curious way, some of the claims made by the 9/11 truth community, especially by some of the wilder extremes of that community, they remind me of the Bush administration weapons of mass destruction claims in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. The principle in operation there was that it didn't matter whether that was true or not. What mattered was that you just kept on saying it and saying it and saying it. And mere repetition alone was supposed to guarantee that this was actually valid. And we see that in the 9/11 issue also. Many of the demolition methodologies, such as thermate or cutter charges, or indeed even space beams, would have left obvious signatures on the beams, especially if you had used these techniques to cut quite a number of core columns, for example, in the towers. And that's a bit of a problem. It's a physical evidence problem which any perpetrator would have. And perpetrators of crimes don't like leaving clear physical evidence behind which can be used to trap them. It's like knocking off a bank but leaving your driver's license on the counter. That sort of stuff catches up with you. All of these methodologies would have left signatures on those beams. Here's where this weapons of mass destruction thing kicks in. There is a much repeated claim, and it's half-truth, that all of the steel from the Twin Towers was shipped away overseas and melted down before anybody could examine it. And you know it's half true, because steel was taken away and was shipped and was melted down, but not before people had a chance to examine it. And many pieces of steel, there's a warehouse full of the steel, which was retained. NIST, for their report, retained steel. Professor Hassan Astaneh, he secured steel pieces from the recycling site. So the steel was retained, and there's an even, from the perpetrator's point of view, an even more dangerous aspect to it, is that this steel was lying all over the debris field at ground zero, and literally hundreds, thousands of people had an opportunity to examine that. Now, the people who were working on the site there, many of them were people who had building experience, considerable building experience, and they would have been quite capable of spotting unusual signature indications on the beams which they were pulling out of the rubble. And, you know, for a perpetrator, if those signatures were there, that's a damn dangerous circumstance. Now, you get something out into the public domain, which is photographs of steel pieces from the debris, which have got signature indications on them, and you've got a serious problem. Similarly, there were many investigators from NIST inquiries and others. There were about 10 different scientific teams who were either on site or out where the recycling was taking place and where the steel was being processed. And that's an awful lot of people that you've got to try and keep a lid on. If you had done some kind of, as I say, thermate or shaped cutter charges, in fact, even the wacky space beams theory, the directed energy weapons, to give it its official name, those would have also left signature traces. And these are physical evidence that could come back to haunt you. So you don't want to pull something off and then leave physical evidence behind. And that's one of the big arguments against the use of these kinds of techniques to take down the Twin Towers. And yet, this deeply practical question of leaving behind hard physical evidence, if you use those techniques, is brushed aside by the mantra-like repetition of this question of all the steel was shipped away, so they didn't have to worry about leaving signatures behind because no one was ever going to find out because all the steel was shipped away before it could be examined. And as I say, it's the sheer repetition of these assumed received wisdom mantras, which you see on so many less rigorous websites than breakfornews.com in terms of their examination of the evidence. That's not the only issue. You see other things like the free fall claim, that the Twin Towers fell at virtually or almost free fall, and therefore that indicates that that was a controlled demolition. Anybody who's ever spent any time looking at images of the collapse of the towers knows that we have clear photographic evidence of large chunks of the building hitting the street, and in the background a large portion of the remainder of the towers still standing, even as these huge chunks of the towers hit the street. Well, obviously those chunks fell at a free fall rate, and if the entire building fell at free fall rate, then what is it doing standing in the background as these chunks are hitting the ground? This is like 2 + 2 = 4 kind of logic, and yet the claim, such as the free fall claim, is still made again and again and again, presumably on the basis that if you keep claiming it, you can make it true by sheer repetition, and for some people, maybe you can. You know, in fairness, not everybody in the 9/11 Truth movement has accepted these views, and they've been widely critiqued within the 9/11 Truth community, and yet still they persist. They're still out there, and they're still being pushed on websites across the internet. And it's way past time that these claims were subjected to some serious critical review, and if they are invalid, it's way past time that they were dumped from the claims of the 9/11 Truth community, because they have made the community a laughing stock, and that has been very damaging, and of course that's hardly accidental. Another infamous one is pools of molten steel were found in the debris field as the site was cleared, and that's proof that, for example, thermate was used to take down the buildings. Those super high temperatures required to melt steel can only be explained by the use of something like thermate. Of course, the towers which collapsed were not only already on fire and thus already at a high temperature, but the actual process of collapse generated unbelievable amounts of heat within the debris as it fell, and that heat was retained in the debris pile, which was lightly covered with concrete dust, acting as an insulator to keep that heat in there. And so the steel was well capable of reaching those kinds of temperatures in the debris pile. Here's another one. The claim that there was a pyroclastic flow, as it's called, vast clouds of dust at extreme temperatures, and that this is proof that these high temperatures can only be explained by the use of an extremely powerful explosive used to take down the towers. I already mentioned there that the collapse of the towers themselves, the actual friction involved in that, and the thermodynamics of it mean that you are going to generate unbelievable levels of heat, and that's quite sufficient to explain these pyroclastic flows, as they're called. If you've ever pumped up a bicycle tire and then hold the bicycle pump after you're finished pumping, you know what that kind of friction can generate in terms of heat. Here's another one, a much quoted claim which supposedly establishes that this was an explosive collapse, and that is the claim that pieces of steel weighing many tons were hurled hundreds of feet, and that surely proves that vastly powerful explosives were used to take down the towers. Well, no, it doesn't. And a little bit of investigation would show that there is a legitimate explanation for that. As these buildings were coming down, all the air which was between two floors of the building would be compressed and ejected. Now, that air, in order to be ejected out of the floor space in a tenth of a second, is going to have to move at speeds of at least in the order of 500 or 600 miles per hour. That's an incredible speed to have an air mass moving at. And when you've got an air mass moving at that speed, it's effectively operating as a liquid. So it's like a huge wave. And that kind of stuff is well capable of shoving beams out in a wide outward arc. And if the beams are starting from a position of 70 stories up, and they're heading away from the building, driven by a 500 or 600 mile per hour wind away in a wide arc, they are going to land hundreds of feet away. This is just basic physics. Here's another claim, the claim that building demolition shaped cutting charges were used on the Twin Towers, and the booming explosive sounds that can be heard are proof that shaped cutter charges were used. Well, booming explosive sounds are to be expected. We know, for example, that on the service floors in the Twin Towers there were banks of transformers, and we know they were exploding. We know that portions of floors were collapsing. So that explains booming explosive sounds, and there's a big difference between a booming explosive sound and the sound of a shaped cutter charge. You can go on YouTube and take a look at some of the professional building demolition videos and listen to the sounds of those cutter charges going off. They're like a rifle shot magnified 10,000 times. They're a real signature, and they're unmistakable, and those sounds are not heard. Then there are some other claims, for example, that squibs, or ejections of dust about 20-30 floors ahead of the collapse zone, prove that cutting charges of some sort were being used to take down the towers. But those squibs are also as readily explained by air being forced out of the towers through any available exit because of the compression of the air inside the towers as they collapse. And that's an equally valid alternative explanation. So if you are going up against establishment media and the entire establishment trying to make a case about the issues of 9/11, there's no point in coming forward with inconclusive evidence which has a perfectly valid alternative explanation. You need to have the same approach which a prosecutor has going into court to establish a case. A prosecutor goes with strong, firm, convincing evidence, not ambiguous stuff. You don't put up an eyewitness on the stand and ask them, can you identify, was the defendant the person you saw in the bank on that day? And have your witness say, well, yes, it might have been, or it might not. You've just destroyed your own case by putting that kind of a witness up on the stand, because it's completely inconclusive evidence and it only weakens your case. So if there's a valid alternative explanation for squibs, but just drop it. It's not worth it unless you have got firm evidence. And when you take a look at all of these issues which are used to sustain claims of a controlled demolition on 9/11, they simply do not stand up. Now, in the previous audio, part 1, I was talking about the analysis which indicates to me that it was required for psychological operations reasons that the towers would come down. So if they couldn't be taken down by explosives, and if there is no evidence that explosives were used, well, then we're looking at the question of whether these buildings could have been guaranteed to come down simply by striking them with the planes at that speed and at the 30-degree angle which both planes struck the towers. Was that sufficient to guarantee that those towers would fall? And does what we know about the construction of the building substantiate that these buildings could be reliably taken down simply by these plane strikes? And we'll get into that right now. Let's take a break for music first. Thanks to Hawkwind in the forum for this one. This is Jumbo. This is The Beautiful Truth on breakfornews.com. And you're very welcome back. You're on The Next Level, and this is The Beautiful Truth. Much is made of the statement that it's unprecedented for steel-structured skyscrapers such as the Twin Towers to collapse due to fire. And that's true to an extent. But it's also not true, because of course it's unprecedented. These were unprecedented buildings. Nothing like the Twin Towers had been built before, nor has anything like them been built since. These were essentially experimental buildings, and they went way outside existing and well-researched design parameters and into entirely new territory. And by and large they were successful as designs, with the exception that they had grossly inadequate fireproofing. They were already in the process of upgrading the fireproofing, actually. And the other is they had grossly inadequate means of escape, because the stairwells were not sufficiently reinforced in order to guarantee that you could escape from the building in the event of a fire, especially the kind of fire which took place on 9/11. However, those buildings had a number of key vulnerabilities, and if those who carried out the attacks had access to the plans, I'm sure they were quite capable of working out those vulnerabilities and the implications of those vulnerabilities. Let's just step through what they were. We've detailed in part 1 how 90 KSI strength steel was used in the perimeter columns as opposed to 50, which meant that those perimeter columns could be made much thinner than with the lower grade, lower strength steel. That had two big implications. One was that it's guaranteed that if those buildings were struck by planes travelling at around 500 miles per hour, the planes would entirely enter the building, because the at times as light as quarter-inch thick 90 KSI steel was going to be easily penetrated by the planes. So you knew that you could get the planes entirely inside the structure when you hit them, once you were aware of the thinness of the steel in the exterior. And the second implication of that relatively thin steel in the exterior, in the upper reaches of the buildings, is that thin sections of steel are much easier to heat up in a fire, and as a result they are going to deform, and they're going to bend, they're going to twist. That is the big implication of the use of that steel. Ease of entry, and if you get a fire going inside the building, then you're going to produce effects in the perimeter steel. It's not going to hold up, and we see evidence of that in bowing of the perimeter steel just prior to the collapse of the Twin Towers. That's two key vulnerabilities arising out of the nature of the exterior steel, apparent to anybody who studies the plans. And the other vulnerability was that there was a central core and an exterior, and the exterior was connected to the center core by relatively lightweight trusses, which were supporting the floors. Without the floors there, it's actually doubtful whether the exteriors of the building would be capable of standing up. Here's why. The exterior of the building were sections of steel stacked on top of each other up for a height of 110 floors. Apart from the fact they were bolted to each other, what kept them upright, what kept them perfectly aligned vertically, which you have to have, otherwise you're in big trouble, was the fact that they were joined to the core by these floors. So if anything affects the integrity of that connection between the exterior and the core, well, now the exterior is going to be able to flex because it's no longer attached, it's no longer restrained horizontally. And of course, as we know, because of the 30-degree strike angle which the planes took and the subsequent fires following the impact into the buildings, we had floor collapses, and there were implications to those floor collapses. I think that those vulnerabilities made it possible to take down the buildings with planes and to know in advance that you were going to be able to successfully destroy the buildings with planes alone. And there's another aspect, and some eyewitness testimony, we'll get to that later, brings this out. The focus on the fire and the weakening of the structures to the fire should not deflect us from an examination of the actual effect of those high-speed impacts on the buildings on their own, even before the fire is factored in. They were extraordinarily powerful impacts of the planes with the buildings, and they seriously affected the structural impact. And you're very welcome back. So we're going to take a look now at the alternative explanations other than explosive collapse for the collapse of the Twin Towers. And in relation to all of this, I don't need an explosive collapse in the Twin Towers to know that 9/11 was an inside job. Evidence that 9/11 was an inside job is still overwhelming. So I'm not going to go out there pushing a controlled demolition when a controlled demolition is mere icing on the cake. But if it's erroneous icing on that cake, well, then it's a bad move for the 9/11 Truth Movement to be pushing what is an erroneous line when the rest of the evidence is so goddamn conclusive. So let's take a look now at what happened when the planes entered those buildings. One thing that happened was the potential dislodging of fireproofing throughout the structure when the plane struck. Planes struck, remember, at either above or slightly below 500 miles per hour. It was an enormous impact, and there are eyewitness accounts that ceiling tiles were falling off the roof all over that building when it was struck. Overall, the building moved considerably when it was struck, and the shock waves, and boy, do I wish I had the video, which I saw back in those days in 2001, and unfortunately didn't have the bandwidth to download it. But I could, and I have seen high-resolution, high-quality video of the side of the building and the shock waves literally rippling through the structure. I'd like you to do a thought experiment. It's maybe an experiment that NIST could have done, because being unable to establish exactly how much material might have been dislodged by the actual impact of the planes with the building, how much of the fireproofing might have literally shaken loose, they weren't particularly eager to go there and quantify it. But you can perhaps quantify it. You know those monkey puzzles that kids climb on? And imagine going over to it and take a whole lot of talcum powder and sprinkle it liberally, I mean a few pounds of it, all over the steel structure. Now take a large lump hammer or sledgehammer and give that structure a good rattling thump with everything you can muster. Hit that structure on the side real hard, and then put your fingers over your nose. The reason is because you are going to be breathing in talcum powder, because a cloud of talcum powder is going to come off that. Because that's what happens when you hit a steel structure really hard, is the vibration is so intense that it literally shakes off the powder. Now you want to gross that up, and you're talking about sprayed on fireproofing material which have been applied to the trusses in the building, and then you're considering the consequent loosening of that material giving the strength of the impact. I think that there probably was significant loosening of the insulation caused merely by the impact. The best analysis indicates that it wasn't so much the debris moving through the building, and I think that's the case, but it was more a question of the impact itself, which would literally have shaken loose vast amounts of fireproofing, particularly in the area where the planes hit. So that was the first effect. There was also a huge hole created by the impact, and that hole allows air to enter, and you're 80 or 90 stories up, so there's plenty of air up there and plenty of air to feed the subsequent fire. The exterior walls were being held in place vertically by the floors. The floors were all that were holding the perimeter to the core. And in the case of that building, they weren't in a traditional skyscraper design. They weren't steel beams running across from the core out to the perimeter. No, these were lightweight trusses. In normal circumstances, they were quite sufficient to maintain the structural integrity of the building. But if you start compromising the floors, then you've got perimeter wall which now has no vertical stability. The other problem you have is that these exterior perimeter walls, as I mentioned in the audio yesterday, were not standard steel. They had used 90 KSI, which is a strength index for steel, instead of 50 KSI. As a result of that, those exterior columns were as thin as 1/4 of an inch steel, and that made them very easy to heat. The thicker and the more massive the steel is, the tougher it is to heat it up. The thinner it is, the easier it is. So that made these steel columns particularly easy to heat if a fire could get going inside. There's been a lot of talk about the temperature the fire might or might not have reached. And there's some confusion, even among people who have a scientific background, about that issue. Talking about, well, the maximum temperature that kerosene or JP8 jet fuel can burn at is such a degrees, and that's it. So it couldn't have burned any hotter than that. That's wrong. There is no maximum temperature. Let's just take an example of some carpet. Some carpet at room temperature, which begins to burn, will achieve a certain temperature. Yeah, okay, we accept that. But if that carpet is already at about 100 degrees C, because it's sitting on top of something which is really hot, when it begins to burn, it's going to have the additional heat from the burning added to its existing temperature, giving you a new temperature. You can see this yourself when you start off any kind of a furnace fire, because at first, when you're throwing cold fuel into the fire, it takes a while for it to actually get up to speed. But once that whole thing starts to come up in temperature, well, then you're getting some serious heat off it. So it was possible for these fires to reach significant temperatures, certainly up to 1,000 degrees F, which would be enough to weaken the steel by half. But weakening of the steel alone is not the only mechanism to cause a critical destabilization of the building. There's also the issue of lengthening of the steel. See, the steel lengthens when it's heated, and when you start lengthening the steel, it starts to press against wherever that steel is attached to, and now you've got some serious strain. And if that column wants to lengthen and it can't lengthen, then it may buckle instead. Even worse, if some parts of the steel are exposed to extremely high temperature, let's say on the inside, and on the outside the temperature is 100, 150 degrees lower, then that creates that same deforming between the part that wants to expand the most and then the other parts of the beam that don't want to expand much, and so you will actually have buckling of the structural steel, buckling failure. So in addition to the weakening due to the high temperature, you've also got buckling, which is taking place within columns and within the structure. So you have lengthening, softening and buckling going on in the entire structure as this fire develops. And the fire is not consistent. There's an awful lot of that black smoke coming off, and people say, oh, because the black smoke's coming off, that proves the fire couldn't have been very hot. No, there were parts where it was black smoke because it wasn't very hot and it didn't have enough access to oxygen, for example, to get very hot. There were other parts where it did have access to enough oxygen, and there it was extremely hot. So there were hot spots, and this was an asymmetric fire which was spreading throughout the building, and it produced all of these stresses within the steel. Actually, there is a great photo which illustrates some of these points. It's in the forum on breakfornews.com. Just click on the photo that goes with this audio, and that'll take you to the post in the forum. It's an old one. I got it from debunking911.com. It shows a fuel fire, and it's out on a freeway. And what happened was a fuel tanker had a fire. It went on fire. And where did it go on fire? Right under an overpass. And the overpass was supported by two huge steel beams, pretty much like the steel beams you see in the World Trade Center. The heat of the fire lengthened the steel beam. Unfortunately, the steel beam wasn't able to lengthen because it was pinned at either end. And as a result of that, the steel beam actually buckled, and it buckled substantially. I mean, it's a mess. So that happened in the open air with just fuel, just gasoline, causing it. So the theoretical stuff that says, oh no, that can't happen, well, there's the evidence, folks. You should check that photo out. As I say, it's in the forum. And there is another photo in that discussion thread, and I'll take a copy of it. It was posted by Bree. It's an old one again. It shows you the exterior of the building just as those exterior columns began to buckle and the collapse began to take place. It's clear from other photos which were taken around that time that there had been floor collapses. It looks like about 2 floors had collapsed. And of course that left these exterior perimeter columns without any lateral strength to give them vertical stability. What happened, and you can see it in the video sequence, you can see the perimeter columns buckle inwards, and that's it. The collapse begins at that point. Some say that it was partially collapsed floors which were actually exerting an inward pull on those perimeter columns, which compounded the problem and ensured the collapse. But the bowing of the columns wasn't just instantaneous over the course of a few minutes. No, the bowing of the columns was visible. Indeed, it was reported by the police helicopters which were in the area that inward bowing or outward bowing of columns was taking place well in advance of the collapse. It just eventually reached a point where they actually buckled. And there are timed photos, and you can check those out in the NIST reports, timed photos which show the buckling getting worse and worse and worse and worse as these exterior columns began to bow. And that's one of the big problems with the remaining chance of some kind of a controlled demolition being responsible. You see, what you could say is, you could say, well, of course those exterior columns buckled because somebody decided, when the fire had reached a sufficient stage, decided they would pull the plug, and how they would do that is they would cut the core columns, either slightly below where the impact had been or slightly above where the impact had been, so you wouldn't notice it, and cut the core columns with cutting charges or thermate, some say, and then that takes away all of the central support, and now the load is starting to come. It's transferred through the hat truss onto the exterior frame, and the load starts to come on columns which are not capable of supporting it anymore, and that was how it was done. But the problem is that it's the slow, gradual bowing of the perimeter columns which gives the lie to that particular theory, because it wasn't an instantaneous buckling, it was slow, and it took place over a period of at least 20 minutes. So, of course, you've got the other problem is that if you're going to do that, first, there's going to be quite a sound from those cutting charges going off, and second, how are you going to guarantee that you're going to be able to set off those charges? You're talking about charges having to be set quite close to the point of impact, and because of that, you have got difficulties with how you're going to guarantee that those explosives will be in place and will work, and that your plan will work. But I don't even think it's worth going there, because the fact that the bowing took place over a protracted period and then eventually led to a collapse indicates we were watching the slow, progressive collapse of these structures until they reached the point of no return. And that was the gradual mechanism of collapse. And that's confirmed also by both photographic and eyewitness accounts of leaning in the towers, which was also slow and progressive in the final minutes leading up to the collapse, where there were noticeable leans of the order of 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7 degrees. And the problem is when a building like that, which is engineered to be perfectly vertical, and all the steel in it and all the calculations are based on perfectly vertical columns, when a structure like that begins to lean, the end is nigh, folks. But there's another aspect to all this, and it's a story told not from outside, not from photographs, but it's a story told mostly from inside the building. And that's another aspect which I don't think people in the 9/11 Truth movement are either aware of or have taken on board. And that's what was happening based on accounts from firefighters and staff who were present inside in the buildings, and what that tells us. It tells us something else very significant about what was happening, irrespective of fire inside those buildings. I'll be back in just a moment with that. We're going to hear from inside the building mostly, and some accounts from police choppers which were in the air about what was going on inside the building, which I think will bring home the severity of the damage which had been done by the impact alone. I don't think this is fully appreciated. A significant number of core columns had been severed in the buildings. A significant portion of one side in both buildings on the exterior had been severed also. And so this building was shifting, moving, shifting, actually shifting. You can't see that from a mile away with a telephoto lens. But boy, were you aware, if you were inside those buildings, about what was going on. This is from a firefighter's website. It's 911stories.googlepages.com. Most of these accounts either come from Fire Department of New York, and remember there were extensive interviews conducted with Fire Department personnel who survived. And these also come from Port Authority transcripts of radio transmissions, etc., etc. So that's the source of this kind of material. And of course you can say, like Jimmy Walter, that yeah, these people were all working for the government. But they weren't, of course. Let's start with Fire Department of New York Assistant Chief Joseph Callan. A quote from him. Approximately 40 minutes after I arrived in the lobby, that would be the North Tower, I made a decision the building was no longer safe. And that was based on the conditions in the lobby. Large pieces of plaster falling, all the 20-foot high glass panels on the exterior of the lobby were breaking. There was obvious movement of the building. And that was the reason on the handy-talkie I gave the order for all fire department units to leave the North Tower. I did that because I did not think the building was safe any longer. Let's hear from EMS Division Chief John Perugia. Some engineer-type person and several of us were huddled talking in the lobby, and it was brought to my attention it was believed that the structural damage that was suffered to the towers was quite significant, and they were very confident that the building's stability was compromised, and they felt that the North Tower was in danger of a near imminent collapse. I grabbed EMT Zarillo and advised him to proceed to the command post. I told him, you see Chief Grand and Chief Gansey only. Provide him with the information that the building integrity is severely compromised and they believe the building is in danger of imminent collapse. So he left, off in that direction. Firefighter Kevin Gorman. Guys were giving us water, wet rags to put on our head, and we were standing there, and there was a cop I knew who came by and he gave me a drink of water. And then as he was standing there, he said, aviation just reported the North Tower's leaning. I said, which way is it leaning? He said, this way. So we started to turn around walking. John Malley, who was right behind me, I turned around for him because he was doing something, either putting his coat on or something, and as I was looking at him I heard the explosion, looked up, saw like 3 floors explode, saw the antenna coming down, turned around and ran north. Question: about how long would you say it was from when the police officer told you it was leaning? Within 30 seconds. From the NYPD chopper. Quote, about 15 floors down from the top. Looks like it's glowing red. The pilot of one helicopter, Aviation 14, radioed at 10:07 a.m. It's inevitable. Seconds later, another pilot reported, I don't think this has much longer to go. I'd evacuate all people within the area of that second building. Federal engineering investigators say the aviation units reported an inward bowing of the building's columns in the minutes before they collapsed, a signal they were about to fall. According to Shyam Sunder, the concave bowing of the steel was seen on the sides of the towers opposite where the planes hit them. In another radio transmission at 10:21 a.m, the officer said he saw buckling in the North Tower's southern face. Some of this is not pleasant reading or listening. Inside the North Tower now, firefighter Mike Cancel, ladder 10. We could feel the building start to twist above us. I called ladder 10 3 times. Ladder 10, roof to ladder 10. There was no answer. I said, we have to evacuate. The building's coming down. There was no response. On the 56th floor, an architect believes the building was failing structurally. Architect Bob Shelton had his foot in a cast. He'd broken it falling off a curb 2 weeks ago. He heard the explosion of the first plane hitting the North Tower from his 56th floor office in the South Tower. As he made his way down the stairwell, his building came under attack as well. You could hear the building cracking. It sounded like when you have a bunch of spaghetti, you break it in half to boil it. Shelton knew that what he was hearing was bad. It was structural failure, Shelton says. Once a building like that is off-centre, that's it. Structural engineer Al Massetti. At some point, perhaps when I was down around the 20th floor of the North Tower, there was a very clear and distinct radio message. Structural instability. Some fireman had reached the scene of the impact and was able to evaluate what was there and report what he saw. Another engineer from the Department of Buildings reported the structural damage appeared to be immense. In particular, the engineer was worried about how long the North Tower would stand. Police Department Sergeant David Lim. On the way down, we were losing our lights and could feel the building falling apart. You could feel the building starting to collapse internally. Sandra Gonzalez. All the way down, it felt like the ground was falling out from under you. I knew the building had been severely damaged, and all the way down you could feel it was about to collapse. FDNY firefighter Hugh Metham. We reached the 6th or 7th floor and are met by many firefighters coming down the stairs, informing us that the upper floors are collapsing. Port Authority Police Department Chief Joe Morris. And also met with Chief Tony Whittaker, who's the commanding officer of the World Trade Center. At that point, he told me he felt Building 1 was going to collapse very soon, based on what he'd seen. Police Department Sergeant Quentin DeMarco. Captain Whittaker informed the undersigned that no one is to enter the buildings. They were structurally compromised and could collapse. A short time later, I observed Tower 2 collapse into West Street. Firefighter Richard Banachiski. So I was kind of looking around over there, up and down West Street, and looking on VC, and I just remember there was a police officer standing there, and he just started saying, "It's starting to lean, it's starting to lean." Firefighter Dennis Fisher. Guys, get the fuck out of here. That building is going to come down. It's coming down. That building is coming down. We looked at each other. We kind of looked around. We didn't really think it was going to happen. Maybe 15, 20 seconds after he said that, we heard rumbling. We looked up, and I remember as plain as day, I looked up, I saw from the top. I actually watched it with my own eyes. I saw the top start to pancake down. Firefighter Paul Bessler. Just at that point, my radio came as clear as day. Imminent collapse. That's exactly what I heard. I think it was Chief Picotto that was giving the order. We relayed that again, hoping the brothers would hear us above us, and I remember the look on Andy's face, like apprehension that we were going to leave the building. Port Authority Police Department Detective Edward Rapp. While I was on the phone with Stacey at the police desk, we all of a sudden heard metal creaking. I looked up and saw the North Tower buckling from the top. It looked like the north and west sides of the building were twisting and then separating like a banana peel. Robert Jones, ace elevator mechanic. You could see A Tower, the outside. The columns were glowing red by that time, because that had been on fire at least a good 25 minutes by that time. B Tower, I could see tremendous structural damage to the outside of the building. Fire Department Chief Joseph Dunne. Another 10 or 15 minutes or so later, one of my guys said to me, "Listen, the North Tower's making noise. We're not safe here. That building's going to come down too." Tower worker Clyburn Johnson. It seemed we were walking down very calm, very orderly, and all of a sudden you felt the ground was falling out from underneath you. You knew the structure had been altered severely, and the rest of the way down you could feel that. An account from some distance away from Ray Doherty. My Thayer School engineering training came back, and I realised that with that intensity of heat in a building in which steel girders were insulated with asbestos, it had to collapse within 1 hour. I called the fire department, police, etc., and told them the building was guaranteed to collapse. I was told that 911 was only for emergencies and I should call somewhere else. After about 40 minutes, as I saw, I have telescopes, binoculars, etc., the top segment of the building listing about 3 degrees. I left my apartment and went out to walk on the street. Buildings collapse if they list more than 3 degrees. As I walked down Bleecker Street, people gasped as the building collapsed. I should have stayed put and watched. I did for the second tower. We watched the second building. I noticed it was more than 3 degrees, but as the telescope revealed, that was because the beams were buckling on both sides. And I think that's about enough of those eyewitness accounts and testimonies. And I'll post a link to that page. You can check that out yourself. But that just gives us an indication of the degree of structural damage which have been caused to the buildings simply by being hit by the planes, let alone the subsequent weakening of the structure due to what we covered earlier on. When you put it all together, and if you were asked to make a call on it, you'd have to say, being generous, you'd have to say that the case for controlled demolition was inconclusive. But really, on the balance of the evidence that's available to us, when it comes right down to it, it doesn't look like there's any substantial case for a controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. There are issues in relation to Building 7 still, and latest research indicates that there was one period of free fall for Building 7, which is damn hard to explain by any means, either conspiracy or mainstream. So there are issues still there, and we do need to monitor the evidence and keep on top of the evidence. But as it stands right now, the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers issue is a non-runner. That's just one issue, and if it is a non-runner, it's best that the 9/11 Truth movement is not running with it and is concentrating on substantive issues. And there are scores of substantive issues, ranging from the incident on the day, the air response, the US relationship with Al-Qaeda, and on and on and on and on and on. And those significant and substantial issues, those issues need to be ranked in terms of the quality of the issue and the conclusiveness or otherwise of the questions which are raised and the implications and inferences that can be drawn from each of those issues. There is a new section of the forum, the final verdict. There's a general discussion section in there where we'll move a lot of the stuff that we have in the 9/11 forum into that section so that we can bounce it back and forward, get a handle on what are the substantial issues, add some more to it, and as we reach some kind of conclusion on each of these issues, then move the quality material into the final verdict section of the forum, where we can hopefully begin to compile a list of substantive issues which would form a substantial case for the 9/11 Truth movement. I'll follow up with some more audios on this topic and on those other issues, and I look forward to your contributions and knowledge and research adding into the mix on this as we put together the final verdict on 9/11. But that's it for this edition. I will be back very shortly with more, and I do hope you can join me for that. But in the meantime, for breakfornews.com, this has been Fintan Dunne reporting.